Okay, welcome back to our second panel, which we're going to talk about the security networking challenges and mechanisms. It is a true honor that we have our co-host, the Center for New American Security, Senior Fellow for the Asia Pacific Security Program, Dr. Daniel Kleiman, to act as our moderator. Dr. Kleiman, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm Dan Kleiman. I'm a Senior Fellow with the Center for New American Security, one of today's conference organizers. I have the honor of moderating this panel, looking at security networking challenges and mechanisms. This is very much a topic at the core of promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific. It's also a topic in which I have a personal stake, having served as Senior Advisor for Asia Integration at the Pentagon from 2014 to 2017. Security networking is also very much central to our research agenda at the Center for a New American Security. We've actually published two major reports on this topic, the first in 2013 and the second in 2017, and we continue to conduct research in this area. My goal for this panel is very much to maximize time for discussion among everyone here and also Q&A with the audience. So with that in mind, I want to jump right in. We'll start off today's discussion by hearing from three panelists. I'll introduce all three now. The first is John Lee, to my right, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the U.S. Study Center at the University of Sydney. Before that, he served as the Senior National Security Advisor to Australian Foreign Minister Bishop. To my left is Dhruva Jaishankar, who is a fellow at Brookings, India, also a former colleague from my time at the German Marshall Fund and one of India's leading thinkers on grand strategy. And then a little bit farther to my right is my CNAS colleague, Abby Grace, who until recently served on the National Security Council staff in the White House. So a very dynamic, interesting panelist group. Each speaker will have 12 minutes to give their initial remarks, and I will be a pretty rigorous timekeeper, so thank you for keeping within that. And I'd like in your remarks at least to address three questions. This is not exhaustive, you can do more. But we'll all talk through three questions. The first is, how does your respective country define, from a security angle, a free and open Indo-Pacific? The second question, again, from a security perspective, what are the main elements of your country's approach to a free and open Indo-Pacific, unilaterally, but especially bilaterally and multilaterally? And then last, but certainly not least, what are some of the untapped opportunities that exist to realize the security dimension of a free and open Indo-Pacific? So with that, I'm going to turn over to John to give his remarks.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you to the Prospect Foundation, and thank you all for your time today. I thought I would just talk a little bit about some of the security debates that's going on in Australia. Not necessarily within the government itself, but within the experts and the commentators in Australia. And I will address some of Dan's points about the free and open Indo-Pacific. I really begin my comments by making three assumptions. One, that PRC, the People's Republic of China, is the only possible peer competitor to the United States in the region. Two, there is no stable or acceptable balance of power in a region without the United States. And as a geographically distant power, the United States is dependent on allies to maintain its presence in a region. And three, China's policies and the use of its power is the enduring strategic challenge for every single country in a region. Yes, there are other problems like North Korea, but the long game really is China for every single country. So at the very broad level, the way many Australians see it, there are two general approaches that the United States could take. It could become an offshore balancer, or it could engage in what I would call enhanced balancing. I'll talk very quickly about these options. Offshore balancing is essentially the United States walking away, or at least weakening its commitments to allies and partners in the region. And the logic is that the US would do that to avoid the possibility of major conflict with China and insert its power in a much more selective manner as opposed to having enduring security commitments that it currently has. Now, offshore balancing, in my view, just doesn't make sense for a number of reasons. One, if you look at US grand strategy, if you want to talk about it like that, it's basically to prevent the rise of a potentially hostile hegemon on either side of the Eurasian landmass on the western or eastern sides of Eurasia. The US has entered 2 world wars to prevent that situation happening. Now, if the US became an offshore balancer, as some in Australia would suggest, the weakening of its alliances and security networks would be the beginning of the end for the US. It would be a supreme victory for China, whose grand strategy, after all, is to ease the United States out of Asia by weakening its alliances. Offshore balancing, I think, in this context, it's also a very misleading term. It's a misnomer. That route would be the beginning of the end of any stable balance in the region, as the US would be giving up its footholds for any meaningful strategic position in a region. Now, given the economic and strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific, it would be a complete abandonment of a century of US grand strategy. So offshore balancing, in my view, just doesn't make sense. Now, you'll hear some make the argument that the US need not become an offshore balancer as such, but it could step back from the region and help other countries rearm so that they could themselves balance against China for their own ends. Now, this doesn't really work strategically for several reasons. One, the numbers don't add up. If you look at, say, if you take 2017 military spending figures, for example, China's military budget comprises over 70% of all military spending in Northeast Asia and around 62% of all military spending in East Asia. There is no way the US could actually rearm countries indigenously to provide a stable and credible balance against the Chinese. Second, without the US playing an enhanced role, countries in the region would simply be picked off one by one by the Chinese, who would try to win them over through economic seducements or else compel them to take a neutral or isolationist stance. And besides, I think it's difficult to see substantive rearming of Japan, of countries in the region, and countries in the region just simply do not just do what the United States would want them to do. I think you also have to bear in mind that even amongst US allies and partners, there are significant historical and ongoing tensions. So to give you an example, without the US playing a leadership role, it's very difficult to see Japan and South Korea coordinating strategies in Northeast Asia or beyond. So the only option, in my view, we have is what I'd call enhanced balancing by the US and allies and partners. And essentially all I mean by enhanced balancing is an attempt by America and its partners to get more out of the existing security architecture that we currently have. So rather than weakening or unraveling alliances, we try to make the current security networks more effective. So I think my personal view, the most likely scenario is this. The US will end up targeting specific alliance and security partners and direct the bulk of resources and attention to building up bilateral and interoperational capabilities with certain allies and partners. In my mind, the two most important in a broader strategic context are Japan and Australia for the following reasons. In geostrategic and operational terms, both of those countries are well positioned to counter Chinese capabilities in selective areas and significantly complicate Beijing's strategic planning. So, for example, Japan is quite well positioned to lead the defence or countermeasures against China in the northern part of the so-called First Island chain, and Australia can do quite a bit in the southern part and serve as the so-called anchor of the southern part of the First Island chain. Both countries are quite well aligned with the United States, supporting a common notion of a free and open Indo-Pacific. It's very explicit in the doctrines of both countries. They support the enduring principles for US engagement in the region. That is, they want to avoid the emergence of an Asian hegemon in a region. They want to preserve a robust alliance system. They want to ensure free and uninhibited access to the global and regional commons. And this is really what these countries mean by a free and open Indo-Pacific. I would also add, and I'm sure we'll be discussing in the next session, and it was raised in the previous session, that when you think about a free and open Indo-Pacific, it's not just about freedom of navigation, it's not just about the rule of law. There also has to be significant separation of strategic and political objectives and agency on the one hand with economic objectives on the other hand. So even though all three countries, the United States, Australia and Japan, are speaking about countering some Chinese economic, some forms of Chinese economic statecraft, the reality is that these three countries and others are committed to largely a free enterprise, private sector-led, non-state-led vision of economic activity in the region. And I think that is intrinsic in what we mean by free and open Indo-Pacific. It is also likely that governments in Japan and Australia would be supportive of the enhanced emphasis that the US would place on them. Now, in return, I would expect the US to ask for, possibly even demand that these two allies accept a greater share of the security burden with respect to defence spending, hosting American defence assets, and preparedness to absorb diplomatic, economic, and in some situations even military costs. So for example, I think the US would expect and assist Japan to enhance its ability to counter Chinese A2AD capabilities in the northern part of the First Island chain. It may lean on Australia to host military assets of high strategic significance, for example, nuclear submarines. The US would also expect its priority allies and partners to take a broader view of their national and strategic interests. So, for example, Washington would ask that Tokyo take on more interest and responsibility in the South China Sea. It would expect Australia to offer greater support and participation to US activities in the South China Sea. For geostrategic reasons, Vietnam and Philippines, I think post the Duterte government in particular, would be identified as what I'd call tier 2 countries given their strategic importance and willingness to adopt a more competitive or even confrontational approach towards China and for hosting US assets into the future. South Korea's broader strategic importance would really depend on whether the South Koreans remain preoccupied with the Korean Peninsula or whether they were prepared to actually take on a broader strategic role and in a process risk Chinese displeasure. Now, I put Singapore and Malaysia as tier 3 countries. They are willing to support the US presence, but they are not willing to bear significant diplomatic or economic costs in taking on a more competitive mindset. Now, I'm not envisaging a scenario where the US is abandoning its other security and defense relationships or partnerships, but I think the US will explicitly elevate emphasis on a handful of countries that will take on the responsibility. So the US would not seek to remain a decisive actor by downgrading all of its security and defense relationships. I think the US, with the other countries, the tier 3 and for tier 4, 5 countries, they will do what they think they need to do to prevent these countries from bandwagoning the Chinese. But the reality is, in my view, the US will have to choose where they put their resources and thinking and mindsets into the future. Finally, let me just make a comment about Taiwan. It's in China's interest to remove Taiwan from the chessboard. to make Taiwan a non-consideration. I think there are three things that we need to remind, not just Americans, but commentators in the region. One, if the US were somehow to trade Taiwan off for something else, that would be the beginning of the end of the credibility of the US as an alliance partner. That would be the end for the US. Two, it would allow the Chinese a breakout into the Western Pacific, precisely what the US is trying to avoid. Three, we're fooling ourselves if we think that China will be satiated or satisfied once the Taiwan question is solved. It would actually embolden China. It would make China a much more difficult strategic play in a region. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, John. A very compelling case for enhanced balancing. I'm going to turn now to Dhruva Jaishankar.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning, everyone. Ni hao. Ohayo gozaimasu. Thank you to the Prospect Foundation and the co-organizers, the Center for New American Security and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for inviting me. This is my first visit to Taiwan, and very much appreciate being here. I'm going to use my time to make three broad points, not exactly answering all the questions that Dan laid out, but the first being, what is the Indo-Pacific? And what does it mean in general? What's a kind of lowest common denominator way of thinking about it? And specifically what it means for India. Second, what is India actually doing in the Indo-Pacific in the security realm? And finally, I'm going to dwell on a few challenges that I see to the path forward. Perhaps opportunities will flow after taking those into consideration. In my mind, when I go to places like Canberra or Tokyo or New Delhi or Washington, and I hear people talking about the Indo-Pacific, there's some common strands. While our exact definition might differ, there are some common strands across the board. And in my mind, there are three that stand out. The first is that the thinking of the Indian and Pacific Oceans as a single strategic space. And I think that that's really the key defining element of what we mean when we talk about the Indo-Pacific. Again, the details may differ a little bit as to what exactly we're talking about. I'll get into that in a moment. A second area is the emphasis by defining the region in terms of the oceans rather than the continental land masses. It's really elevating the importance of the maritime domain, both for security and for commerce. So emphasizing that this is really an important area. And three, by increasing the thinking of the region in a wider scope, we bring in countries like quite squarely into the center, Australia, the South Pacific, but also a country like India, which is the largest economy, the largest country by population in the Indian Ocean region. The adoption of the concept of the Indo-Pacific concept by different countries has really been driven by shared anxieties about China and China's rise and the manner of in which China is wielding its newfound power. Who would have anticipated 3 decades ago that the People's Republic of China's first overseas military facility would be in Djibouti, on the western end of the Indian Ocean, and that a second military facility might very well come up in Pakistan, also on the Indian Ocean coast. So I think the very fact that China is now playing a much more active role in the Indo-Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, has meant quite naturally that the Indo-Pacific has gained currency as a concept in different capitals. For India, the adoption of the term, it started being adopted in strategic circles between 2006, 2009. I think Rui-san made a mention in the last panel about Prime Minister Abe's speech in India in 2007. And so in unofficial circles, it had already started to gain some currency. In 2013, the previous Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh used it in an official context in a speech in Tokyo, spoke about the Indo-Pacific region. But it really it has been elaborated in much more detail only this year, most specifically in the speech given by Prime Minister Modi, the current Prime Minister, at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. And Modi, again, mentioned a few things in terms of how he saw India's role in the Indo-Pacific. One, he said that this should be a free and open region, in his words, based on the consent of all, not the power of the few. And he elaborated a little bit on that this includes an emphasis on the rule of law, on freedom of navigation and overflight, on an intensification of trade and investment, and a sustainability of financing to ensure that there was not insurmountable debt. He also emphasized the inclusive nature of the Indo-Pacific, and I think this is very important, that it was consistent with the prevailing international order, and particularly in this part of the world, and that the purpose was not to split or divide Asia, but in fact to reinforce and unify that order. Furthermore, he emphasized that for India, it's not a strategy, and I think this is where there's some differences between India on the one hand and the United States and Japan on the others. In fact, the Indo-Pacific is a natural space for India to carry out its Act East policy, which in some ways preceded this, in order to preserve a favorable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region. In my mind, India's Act East policy has several components and several pillars. These include securing the near neighborhood, including the Indian Ocean region, integrating with Southeast Asia in particular, but the broader region as well, improving defense relations, particularly, but not exclusively, with the Quad countries. I'll get into a little bit more detail about that. And managing a very multi-pronged and very complex relationship that India has with China. India and China have a large territorial dispute. They have a large bilateral trade relationship, but a very one-sided one. So managing that relationship is another element of it. I'll just go into a little bit more detail on the first three elements of it from a security point of view. In terms of securing the Indian Ocean region, the Indian Navy has, in the past year or so, a little year and a half, significantly increased its operational tempo. It's identified 7 zones across the Indian Ocean, from the Gulf of Aden to the Straits of Malacca, where it now engages in year-round patrols. And this is a big difference from years past. There's been a big focus on maritime domain awareness, and India has entered into a number of diplomatic agreements and arrangements with countries around the region to improve maritime domain awareness. India has been involved in the development of infrastructure, strategically important infrastructure in such places as the Mauritius and Seychelles, both countries that India provides military assistance to. In 2017, the Indian Navy was in the Pacific for over about 2/3 of the year, again signaling a much more increased and active presence east of the Malacca Straits. But perhaps most importantly, India has entered into a series of logistics and resupply and replenishment agreements with countries such as the United States, France, Indonesia, Singapore, and Oman. And this means that essentially the Indian Navy now has the ability to operate from Okinawa to Reunion, from Sabang in Indonesia to Duqm in the Middle East. With Southeast Asia, again, there's been an acceleration in India's defense engagement with this region. India hosted all 10 leaders of ASEAN in January of this year for its National Day celebrations. And just to give a few examples, India now provides space for the Singaporean armed forces to do armored and air exercises in India. It provides technical assistance to the Myanmar military. It trains Vietnamese combat aircraft pilots. It's developing port infrastructure in Indonesia. It performs coordinated patrols with Thailand in the Andaman Sea. And it's just had joint exercises with Malaysia. And that just gives just some of this is pretty low-level engagement and very incipient, but this is just a number of initiatives that are already underway. More importantly, India has been engaging with the countries that comprise the Quad, and there's been a lot of discussion about the quadrilateral initiative that involves India, the United States, Japan, and Australia. I should be clear that this is at present very modest. It's a grouping of 4 countries that has met at a working level once this year, once last year, in a dialogue led by the foreign ministry. So it's nothing even close, remotely close to a defense agreement or anything quite like that. However, the focus on the Quad sometimes overlooks what's happening in the bilaterally and trilaterally amongst these 4 countries. So India now, for example, has 2+2 dialogues involving the foreign and defense ministries with all other 3 countries, with the United States, which will be in a few weeks, on September 6th, with Japan and with Australia, which was started last year. By 2019, it's quite probable that India will have ground, air, and naval exercises again with all three of those countries on a relatively routine basis. It has developed trilateral groupings with, for example, India, Australia, Indonesia, India, Australia, Japan, India, US, Japan. With these countries, there's a trilateral working group involving, infrastructure working group involving India, the United States, and Japan. In addition to the logistics agreements with the United States, India will be negotiating one with Japan. There's an expectation that this will be finalized by October of this year. There's also increasingly interoperable equipment. All four countries will soon have P-8 aircraft that will make them more interoperable. But despite all of this, I would emphasize that from India's point of view, this is not coalescing into an alliance. These are, in fact, but what this will be is something very valuable, which is a set of partnerships that will improve information sharing at all levels, capacity building efforts, and interoperability. I'll end with some challenges. I've laid out, in some ways, a number of ways in which India has accelerated its engagement with the Indo-Pacific in the security realm in the last year or two, and over the next year. But I see at least four major challenges. One is a challenge of perception. What I hear in many countries around the region, particularly in Southeast Asia, is of the Indo-Pacific as a divisive concept. As somehow comparable to the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think repeatedly emphasizing the consistency with ASEAN unity, with ASEAN centrality, and separating the Indo-Pacific idea from the Quad and the Malabar naval exercises, for example, would be a way of making this more durable and palatable, and in fact be a more accurate way of reflecting what it's all about. But overcoming these perceptions will be a challenge. A second is coordinating security policy and economic policy. I know the next panel will go into that in more detail. For India, while we have seen considerable developments on the security front, I don't think it has necessarily kept pace. Economic policy, India's economic policy has necessarily kept pace. And a lack of economic integration that India has with the region still is a constraint. This applies to a lesser degree to the US as well. And we have seen in some ways trade and security not exactly working hand in hand. A further complication is the role of the private sector. In India, while there's great enthusiasm in the government for engaging strategically with the region, the Indian private sector is not always on board. Third, there's sometimes an inordinate obsession with geography and a sort of literalism. So for example, a lot of people feel that the Indo-Pacific concept ignores issues on land. And I think that that's a very narrow way of thinking about it. While obviously there's an emphasis on the maritime domain, I don't think this comes necessarily at the exclusion of land-based cooperation. Also in terms of defining the geographical scope, the US defines it as the US Indo-Pacific Command's area of responsibility, which is a nice, convenient, bureaucratic. But for India, a lot of the real concern is west of that, is in terms of particularly Chinese activity in the Middle East and in East Africa. So finding ways, I think, to widen the concept would be helpful, but I don't think we should be caught up in these obsessions on the literal definition of the Indo-Pacific. We will have slightly different definitions. There isn't, for example, a unified definition of the Asia-Pacific region. Finally, I think at least from India's point of view, there will always be constraints on capacity and resources. Again, despite the great emphasis that the Indian government has put on a lot of this, its military budget is still less than 2% of GDP, within which the naval budget is about 15 to 17% of GDP. So it's still a very small amount, and changing that will take some time and take a lot of effort and be politically difficult. I mentioned, for example, the Indian Navy has upped its operational tempo significantly, but having the ships to continue that, particularly in the long term, is still a concern. And finally, India's resources will still be somewhat constrained. That being said, it has increased. India provides over $1 billion of direct aid now per year. And last year approved about $8 billion of state-backed financing, much of it which will be going to the Indo-Pacific region. So I'll end on that note. Look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dhruva, for that comprehensive view of sort of how India looks at the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific. I will turn now to Abigail Grace.
Hi all, my name is Abigail Grace and I'm from the Center for a New American Security in Washington, D.C. I'd like to thank you all for having me here today and thank you in particular to the Prospect Foundation for your superb facilitation of this forum. I'm delighted to join you all to discuss U.S. security perspectives on a free and open Indo-Pacific. Today I'm here as a private citizen, but until May I served as a civil servant in the National Security Council's Asia Directorate at the White House. And there one of my primary responsibilities was participating in the coordination and the development of the U.S. free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Given my experience serving a year and a half under President Obama and a year and a half under President Trump, my goal today is to help you all understand the continuities and the change that we're seeing in the United States policy towards Asia. Dr. Kleiman has provided us with several great opening questions for fodder for our conversation today, and we could spend hours on the first, which is how do we define a free and open Indo-Pacific? But in the interest of time, I'll be brief. Candidly, defining and communicating what the United States sees as a free and open Indo-Pacific was an initial challenge the administration faced when rolling out this strategy in conjunction with the president's trip to the region in November of 2017. Even this morning, we heard many questions on this topic from panelists. U.S. leaders' aspirational vision for the region is best encapsulated in the president's remarks at the Da Nang APEC CEO Summit, where he described states in the region as a constellation of nations, each a bright star and satellites to none. The president's anecdotes throughout his Da Nang speech highlighted the unique contributions of many specific Southeast Asian nations over the course of history and were developed with this broader theme in mind. It was also developed in the recognition among many of the president's foreign policy advisors that perhaps the most compelling China strategy for the United States is not actually about China, but it's in being confident in what we have to offer to the region and what alternatives and values we stand for. I think in response to valid concerns from the region that the United States was not being clear enough in what the administration truly means by a free and open Indo-Pacific, Secretary Pompeo included a very explicit definition of this term in his recent remarks in late July. He defined free as having all nations able to protect their sovereignty and free from coercion by other countries, and free as meaning good governance and the assurance that citizens can enjoy their fundamental rights and liberties. When defining open, he defined it as all nations enjoying open access to seas and airways, and also the peaceful resolution of territorial and maritime disputes. Still today, we see ASEAN states expressing concern that this return of the Quad would somehow diminish its centrality, and China continues to view the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy as a multifaceted containment strategy only designed to thwart its rise. And from my vantage point, neither of these are far from the case, but it's clear that we here today still have more work to do to achieve this goal of inclusivity that I think Prime Minister Modi really articulated well during his Shangri-La speech this past May. So Dr. Kleiman's second question for us today was to discuss the unilateral, bilateral, and multilateral aspects of our respective countries' approach. I think fortunately for us all, and in contrast to some U.S. engagement in other areas of the globe, most aspects of U.S. strategy in the free and open Indo-Pacific is highly multilateral. Certainly, recent funding increases for the Department of Defense, which are true globally, not just in the Indo-Pacific, are more unilateral in nature. And so are individual U.S. presence operations in the South China Sea. But the crux of U.S. strategy is to work in coordination with partners and allies in the region to collectively achieve this shared vision. This is not a military alliance, as perhaps some and other panelists suggested. It is more of a coalition of the willing, one might say. And from a security perspective, U.S. interlocutors predominantly see this strategy sharing two dimensions, both of which I believe were reflected in Secretary Pompeo's definition. The first is promoting sovereign and capable states, and the second, championing open access of seas and airways. On the first pillar, sovereignty, a particular emphasis of the current U.S. administration has been the notion that all states should be secure within their own sovereignty. To achieve this end, the administration is taking steps to expedite access to arms sales for particular partners and allies, but also increased allied and partner capability, specifically on technical aspects. From a bilateral perspective, the Department of Defense is taking a keen interest in reducing the timetable to approve sales and transfers to close allies, which in the past could take over 5 years. At the same time, they're still balancing longstanding non-proliferation norms to ensure that any transfers happen with regard to international law. And now, this is not a substitute for enduring U.S. presence and commitment that John was discussing earlier. I think, if anything, we should view these sales as complements in enabling countries to increase their own capacity to continue working with the U.S. The recent RIMPAC exercise was also a testament to U.S. military cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. With 25 nations and 25,000 personnel from across the globe participating, events such as these are a visible reminder of the enduring American commitment to regional security ties. Furthermore, this year's Malabar exercise was another venue for the U.S. to continue deepening and strengthening its relationship with India, which is now designated a U.S. major defense partner, and Japan, one of our most capable allies. These deepening trilateral arrangements, as other panelists have discussed, are an important aspect of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. So the second pillar, access, is perhaps more visible than the first and has certainly been an enduring feature of U.S. regional policy. The U.S. views sustained and unimpeded sea and air access in military and commercial domains as fundamentally unnegotiable. Within the U.S. national security apparatus, there's bipartisan consensus that maintaining access to international water and airspace must remain a key objective of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Visible and regularized U.S. presence operations continue in the South China Sea. Furthermore, long-standing U.S. allies, such as the United Kingdom and France, have also increased the frequency of their patrols. Partnerships like this, which I know many of the countries represented in this room also actively contribute to, will be what it takes to demonstrate through actions, not just words, that we envision this same shared future for the region. It's worth noting that there's strong support for this policy of open access throughout both U.S. political parties, which was exemplified through the recent passage of the fiscal year 2019 National Defense Authorization Act. But as much as we've done so far, there's still a lot of progress that must be made if the countries here today wish to see freedom and openness as the prevailing Indo-Pacific values. I'd like to leave us with a few concrete recommendations. First, countries throughout the region interested in the maintenance of a free and open order should develop a common operating picture for the Indo-Pacific and its future. In the past few months, we've seen a lot of progress on this front. The overwhelming congruities in our respective national strategies are indicative of this. However, instead of these strategic consultations being a one-off event in the preparation of a national review, we should institutionalize and regularize these contacts and ensure that one another's insights are enriching our own approaches. In support of this common operating picture, the U.S. should increase and expedite intelligence sharing with Indo-Pacific allies and partners. Secondly, we should continue increasing interactions between the countries here today with a special emphasis on creating and sustaining a networked web of bilateral and trilateral relationships. Other like-minded partners should step up cooperations in third country locations, most at risk of falling into illiberal behavior. Recent reports that the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, and France are considering increasing diplomatic staffing and coordination in the Pacific Islands is a welcome example. I'd also offer that the U.S. and Taiwan's global cooperation and training framework should be used as a template for the U.S. and allied technical capacity building and training throughout the Indo-Pacific region. Additionally, the U.S. should reinvigorate longstanding alliances with the Philippines and Thailand in support of this inclusive Indo-Pacific vision. Rather than hewing solely to mutual defense commitments and strong military-to-military ties, the U.S. should diversify economic and people-to-people interactions with these countries, proving that the inherent value of a free and open Indo-Pacific is best seen through our actions. Finally, the security aspect of a free and open Indo-Pacific is by far the most comprehensively formed. I'd urge us all to listen to our colleagues on the economics and governance panels this afternoon to hear more about what each of us can do to deepen cooperation in these dimensions and ensure that a free and open Indo-Pacific is truly cross-cutting. To conclude, one of the reasons that I'm so personally fond of a free and open Indo-Pacific is that the strategy is rooted in the keen recognition that the U.S. alone will never be capable of securing the future that we all envision for this region. That's why so many diverse nations, all of which who have long-standing and deep ties, rooted in shared values, are able to cooperatively develop and support this shared vision. And that's something quite special. Solutions like these should serve as a template for 21st century U.S. global engagement. Even the makeup of today's conference is indicative of the opportunities that lie ahead. So thank you all again for being here today and for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. I look forward to the other panelists' remarks and any questions.
Thank you, Abby, as well as John and Dhruva for such insightful presentations. We'll now turn it over to our discussants for their quick takes. I will introduce all three and then we'll go one by one. We have to my left Satoru Mori, who's a professor at Hosei University. To the far right, at the edge, is Bunji Ohara, who is currently a senior fellow at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. And then to my far left is Chung-Yi Lin, who is president of the Institute for National Defense and Security Research. Each will have 10 minutes, but they can take less to give their kind of hot takes on the comments made by the presenters, as well as their own thoughts. So we'll start with Satoru.
Thank you, Dan. First of all, I want to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me to this very prestigious conference. It's a real honor to be able to speak here today. What I'd like to do is just make a sort of a brief observation and share a perspective on the strategic rationale behind the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And then pitch maybe a couple of questions to the three presenters. I think they can pick and choose whichever one they would like to address in their follow-up remarks. The free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, the official explanation delivered by the Japanese government, for example, goes on to say that this is not really targeted against a particular country. But I think there is no question that the central strategic task for the regional states in this part of the world is to manage challenges resulting from China's growing economic, military, and diplomatic influence. And when we think about China's aims, I believe the Chinese Communist Party is pursuing multiple objectives to sustain their legitimacy at home. But one of them is to basically justify and legitimize its claims to what it calls core interests among various states. In other words, to make countries recognize the legitimacy of their self-claimed interests and rights in the region. And in order to pursue this goal, they are taking three basic approaches. One is economic statecraft, and second is political warfare, and third is military buildup and modernization. I think these three lines of effort are all used so that China's self-claimed interests and rights are being accepted by the regional states. So, for example, when we think about the military dimension, obviously this is trying to build up capabilities in order to not only coerce other countries, but trying to send a signal to third countries that China will be capable of fending off any sort of intervention by the United States if there is some sort of contingency in the region. So these three lines of efforts, the overall effect of these efforts is the hierarchicalization of international relations, where China has the ability to compel or even force states to accept China's self-claimed interests and rights. And for other states, this means, I believe one of the panelists in the earlier session mentioned, that this means the erosion of national sovereignty and political independence. And so, for example, in Japan's case, one of the nightmarish scenario, diplomatic nightmarish scenario would be to have, for example, China-ASEAN summit come out with a joint statement saying that the sovereignty of the Daoitai belongs to China. That would be a sort of a disastrous outcome for Japan. We don't want to see that happen. And so the central challenge is to sort of create and nurture an environment that allows countries to withstand that kind of imposition of Chinese positions and interests and rights in this part of the world. So I think free and open Indo-Pacific strategy initiatives essentially aim to reinforce the foundations of national economic health, political independence, and security defense capacity. And I think this will probably deliver two kinds of effects. Number one is to mitigate and counter the hierarchicalization of international relations in the Indo-Pacific region. To use a more simple term, this is the establishment of Chinese regional hegemony. And secondly, the second effect is to basically to create the foundation to uphold a rules-based order where rights and obligations are more evenly distributed among various regional states, and disputes are resolved based on shared and accepted rules and norms and not naked coercion. So I think that's the sort of the basic big picture rationale that should sort of underpin the various kinds of initiatives that are pursued under the rubric of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. So the two questions that I want to raise today, number one is about resource constraints. I think a couple of presenters referred to this problem. In order to overcome the issue of resource constraints, I think there are several approaches to do this. One is private-public partnership. I think Admiral Stavridis mentioned this earlier in his keynote. And second is obviously international cooperation. How do you pool resources among multiple nations and sort of invest those resources more effectively? When it comes to, for example, capacity building, I think there should be a country-by-country tailored capacity building pursued by countries like Japan, US, Australia, and hopefully India in the future, so that investments in that area are deconflicted and put in more effectively. And the third one would be prioritization. And this I think, is a sort of an issue. I think maybe John briefly mentioned that the United States might focus on countries that are ready to share the responsibility. It makes me wonder what kind of sort of measurement, what kind of standard should we apply in order to determine where to prioritize our resources. Different countries probably may have different standards of judgment, but I was wondering what the respective countries would sort of emphasize when it comes to prioritizing resource allocation, when it comes to pursuing various initiatives under the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy. So that's the first question. Second question, the so-called sharp power issue. How can we cooperate to deal with China's political warfare? I think ultimately each country has to deal with this issue nationally to sort of counter this kind of Chinese political interference in domestic political processes. But I think certain countries are already taking forward-leaning approaches. I think the US State Department has established a Global Engagement Center to kind of deal with this issue. And I think Australia has underwent some experiences in incidences of Chinese interference in Australian domestic politics, and they're coming up with new initiatives to counter or deal with this issue. So I was wondering whether there are some sort of a best practice sharing sort of cooperation that could be pursued when we try to address the political dimension of this challenge. So those are the two questions that I would like to raise. So thank you very much. Yeah, I'll end there.
Great, thank you. Over to Bunji Ohara for his comments.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the distinguished speakers for the informative briefings. And I'd like to introduce my idea first and raise some questions. Of course, the so-called rise of China imposed the regional or international society the stress. On the other hand, now the U.S. pressure to the China is very effective. It's not simple reason. China has the very strong sense of victims, like the century of humiliations. And also they insist, they believe they have China has the right to recover the prosperity before the century of humiliation. So the perception, the status quo are different between we and China. So it is one of the big problem to discuss with the Chinese officials or scholars when we discuss how to keep the stable condition in the region. But also the why the U.S. pressure is such effective to the China. It also has the domestic reason in China. Now the President Xi tried to grip all of the power in his hand, but China needs to reform, especially mainly the economic structure. But many political leaders in China are afraid of that, the personal dictatorship. So some has the motivation to use the U.S. pressure to undermine the President Xi's authority. And PLA also has the different ideas from other political leaders because PLA is the main target of the anti-corruption operation by President Xi. So this situation has the huge influence on the regional security environment. But it is also a good opportunity for us to reconsider how to build the security network in this region. Before this situation, the Japanese people tend to rely on the U.S.-Japan alliance and rely on the U.S. Military support when it comes to discuss the security issues around Japan. But of course, Japan has to make effort to build up our military capability and security network by ourselves. One of the problems in this region, each country has each national interest. I once tried to build network in the Southeast Asian region. We could not finish building the network because huge perception gap between the each countries in the Southeast Asian region, and also the differences of the national interest. It is not easy to separate the pro-China and anti-China, or the pro-US or pro-anti-US in this region. They are very pragmatic, and each country has the each idea to deal with issues in this region. So it is difficult to establish the institutional or organization in this region. Of course, the ASEAN is the great platform for discussion, but it is difficult to take action because they need the full agreement from every countries. So my idea to how to build or establish network must be the networked bilateral cooperation, because the bilateral cooperation is the best way to take action. But still, the only two countries are not enough influence. Now the US and China are playing the major power game. Maybe the India may join the game in the future, but still there are many actors in this region. We need to change the image of the US-China confrontation. So we need the network of the countries. And the network or the countries need to take action. So it is my basic idea. So I have two questions. Dr. Lee introduced the Australian strategy, and I mentioned balances. How to make balance? What is the balance itself between the democratic countries and China, or the status quo, or the situation which China insists, and how to make balance between China. As I mentioned, it is difficult to make China to understand. We cannot change the status quo by forces because they believe they have rights. And one other thing is the framework of quadrilateral cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. We organize some Quad conference. I also recognize the framework lacks of the point of view from the Southeast Asian region. So Southeastern region is the center of the Indo-Pacific geographically, and also they have the region has the potential to develop and to be the third actors, huge actors in this region. So how to involve the Southeastern region? Of course, we need to the framework ASEAN, but as I mentioned, ASEAN is not good to the take action. So what is the concrete measure to involve them? Thank you.
Great, thank you, Bunji. I now turn to Dr. Changyi Lin for the final discussing comments.
Thank you, especially to Dr. Chen Tangzhan and also Dr. Lai Yizhong, Prospect Foundation. And I try to summarize some key issue in this panel. And I don't use Facebook, I don't use Twitter, but I do read through the paper documentation, and that is the documentation my comment are based upon. So in the eyes of the US government, the PRC is a revisionist power. And the PRC has expanded its power at the expense of the sovereignty of other country. So in the statement of Harry Harris, US ambassador stationed in Seoul, when he mentioned that the PRC is a disruptive transitional force in the Indo-Pacific. And then Secretary Pompeo mentioned in June, the PRC is predatory economic government that is long overdue in mean tackle. And John Lee mentioned the offshore balancer. And in the US National Security Strategy in December last year, it mentioned that states throughout the region are calling upon sustained US leadership in a collective response that is not to uphold a regional order, respect for sovereignty and independence. And in National Defense Strategy in January this year, it described the PRC as a strategic competitor and using predatory economic to intimidate its neighbor while militarizing the named feature in the South China Sea. And also in that same document, it mentioned that the PRC will continue to pursue a military modernization program that seeks Indo-Pacific regional hegemony in the near term. And then I try to summarize the Trump administration remark regarding the Indo-Pacific strategy when he mentioned in Tokyo before reaching in Da Nang, he mentioned two components of the Indo-Pacific strategy. Number one is US-Japan infrastructure investment, and the second one is regarding strategic energy partnership. And President Trump mentioned that it's very important, economic security is national security. And he also mentioned 3 principles. But the most concrete and most comprehensive statement regarding the Indo-Pacific strategy should be given credit to Secretary Pompeo when he mentioned in July 3 major components. Number 1, digital connectivity and cybersecurity partnership. And second one, infrastructure project, investment project. And third one regarding energy. And when Secretary Pompeo preached the economic assistance and the funding for Indo-Pacific strategy as Foreign Secretary, Foreign Minister of Beijing, or the PRC, Wang Yi, tried to make a remark or ridicule of the United States. And in Pompeo's remark regarding the geographic context, he mentioned that the Indo-Pacific, which stretch from the US West Coast to the West Coast of India. And then he tried to give definition of free, good governance, open access to sea and airway. Economically speaking, open means fair and reciprocal trade. And he also mentioned the mechanism regarding the Indo-Pacific strategy, including ASEAN, APEC, Lower Mekong Initiative, and Indian Ocean Rim Association. And then I will touch upon the role of Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific strategy. And President Tsai mentioned that Taiwan can make a significant contribution to the United States' new free and open Indo-Pacific strategy through sharing the mission to defend the common goal of freedom and openness. And Taiwan has exercised effective jurisdiction over the Taiping Island in the South China Sea, and also claimed the sovereignty over the Diaoyutai or Diaoyutao or Senkaku Island. As you could see from this map, Taiwan is located at the center of the East Asia. But President Trump mentioned that Vietnam is, geographically speaking, is the center of the Indo-Pacific. However, as you could see, the response from the Trump administration, Alex Wong, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, when he mentioned here, and then back to Washington, D.C., mentioned another time, when Alex Wong mentioning that Taiwan is an example for the entire Indo-Pacific region, and also Randy Schreiber, Assistant Secretary of Defense, he remarked in July, Taiwan is a partner in promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific and can make valuable contributions. And in practice, as you could see from this slide, the upper one is the digital divide, digital opportunity that fall on the first component of the Indo-Pacific strategy, the cybersecurity digital opportunity. And the second one, the new director here from AIT, staging in Taipei, he attended a transnational crime workshop. So through the US-Taiwan Global Cooperation and Training Framework, Taiwan can make its own unique contribution. However, regarding the status quo surrounding Taiwan has been undermined and sabotaged by the PRC. That is from one statement from Defense of Japan just released the other day. The PRC attempt to change the status quo by coercion. So the PRC fighter jet, bomber, they are flying not only surrounding the water and airspace in Taiwan, but also in Japan. And in the past 2 years, the name change tactic from Beijing, putting the pressure on Taiwan, and then diplomatic ally. We lost 5 altogether diplomatic ally in past 2 years. And then my final observation, I will try to direct your attention. What are the reactions from Beijing? It came from China Daily on August 23rd, when Beijing mentioning that some kind of new discourse building, for example, using the term Indo-Pacific Community or Shared Future of Mankind, or the Indo-Pacific and the Belt and Road Initiative. And the second reaction from Beijing, Beijing mentioning that the PRC should continue to pursue the strategic tradition of exercising self-restraint in terms of security, and in the meantime, to adopt MOOTW, building construction in the South China Sea, defend its national sovereignty and security interests at a lower cost. And number 3, Beijing reaction focus upon and pursued stability in the surrounding region. Beijing mentioned that ASEAN has not been given vital attention in the US Indo-Pacific strategy, and the PRC should pay attention to this. And that will be my last slide. And number 4 of Beijing reaction, possible reaction, is to take advantage of situation in other regions. For example, Beijing should strengthen strategic cooperation with Russia, Iran, and other countries, and take advantage of the increasing challenges to the US in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East. And the last one, but not the least, and the PRC can make use of the Belt and Road Initiative, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRIC, and AIIB. So we have the mechanism competing with each other in the Chinese side, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in the US side, APEC, ASEAN, Lower Mekong Initiative. And challenges, regarding the challenge, the PRC is not the only challenge. The government position in New Delhi regarding the Indo-Pacific strategy is certainly one of the key components. And I will stop there, and I use up my time. I thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Lin. We are going to very quickly go through a few questions that the discussants posed, and then open it up, since I'm conscious that time is ticking away. So the question about Chinese political interference, I want to bracket. We have a roundtable later on in which I suspect John will actually address that topic in depth, so stay tuned. But there are 3 questions that I do want to throw out for very quick responses from our panelists. The first question, and I'll go through all 3, was essentially, where should resources be prioritized and why, from a security perspective, a key question, given that all of the democracies involved have very finite resources. The second question, under the umbrella of a free and open Indo-Pacific, what is, and I would throw out, what is one thing, one high impact policy that might help to sustain a favorable military balance? And then third, what is the best way to integrate Southeast Asia into this concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific? So I'm going to start in the reverse order than we had our presenters speak. So we'll begin with Abby.
Thanks, Dan. So the first thing that I would say about this sort of resource constraint question is I think it's important for us to simultaneously play offense and defense. So I mentioned in my remarks this notion of third country states at the risk of, falling into liberal tendencies. I think it's certainly important that the U.S. and partners and allies place an emphasis there. But I also think we can't wait for dominoes to start to fall and that we need to focus on building resiliency in the interim. So it's important that we remain conscious of this sort of dual approach. I also highlighted in my remarks this increased cooperation between the US, UK, Australia, and France and the Pacific Islands. To be frank, if we all have common goals and values for the region, there's no reason why all of us have to do everything at once, right? We need to cognizantly look at ways where each of us can use our own comparative advantage and maybe take the lead on certain challenges. With regard to Southeast Asia, again, I mentioned the Philippines and Thailand in my remarks. I think, too, that the U.S. should seek to work with them, other countries like Singapore, and even recently Malaysia, given their election, and seize these opportunities and make sure that it's not just the U.S. and maybe quadrilateral countries sort of going out in front with this free and open vision, but that we're reminding countries why they themselves should be engaged and participating in this framework. Thanks.
Great. Dhruva.
Thanks. I'll just mostly take the question on two of them. On resource constraints, I think there are three things that are possible, that are ongoing, but certainly we can do a better job on. So one is prioritization, I think, as Satomori mentioned, which is where you stand is based on where you sit, I suppose. So obviously different countries will have certain regions where they have priority. John mentioned this a little bit, Australia and Southeast Asia. So for India, I think, the South Asia, if you look at where India's investment has been both economic and in terms of security cooperation, it's really been prioritizing South Asia, and then the Indian Ocean littoral region that extends to Southeast Asia, East Africa, and the Middle East. And that's where the bulk of Indian assistance has gone and the bulk of effort. A second way is, I think, better coordination. This is what some of the infrastructure working group, so while we may not have like joint projects, for example, and I don't want to eat into the next panel, which will discuss some of the economic elements in more detail, coordinating what different countries are doing, I think, is going to be more and more important, and that means better communication, because there are going to be some problems with doing joint projects. To give one example, India-Japan ventures are still inhibited to some degree by a Japanese unwillingness to use ODA for dual-use projects, which have a potential military purpose. So I think to the extent possible, coordinating rather than cooperating might be a way forward for some of this. Finally, I think we shouldn't fall into the trap of trying to blindly emulate what China is doing in many respects. I think maintaining a certain set of principles when it comes to investments is going to be valuable and is going to be a way of differentiating, and ultimately it will make these projects and these investments commercially viable and sustainable in the long run. So I think sort of a blind emulation and blind response is not the way forward. On the question of involving ASEAN, it's something that's been a major preoccupation. India has invested more in ASEAN at the political level. It is, for the first time, set up a separate division in the foreign ministry and an ambassador to ASEAN that is separate from the ambassador to Jakarta. So it's actually upgraded its diplomatic efforts with ASEAN. At the same time, in terms of security and trade, it's actually started to deal more bilaterally with several countries. And again, there's been a differentiation. Obviously, Indonesia by virtue of its size, Singapore by virtue of its location and its orientation, Vietnam, Myanmar these are countries that have taken some priority for India, but there's been much more fruitful engagement on a bilateral basis, and we have seen, to their credit, many ASEAN countries now becoming more open to this idea. So, for example, Indonesia has become much more open to the idea of the Indo-Pacific. They've now incorporated some of the language into their own official vocabulary, and have started participating in things like the India-Australia-Indonesia trilateral dialogue, rather than what was earlier being much more wedded to ASEAN-centric formulations.
Thanks. Over to John.
I'll start with the Southeast Asian and ASEAN question. And, you would think that the free and open Indo-Pacific would be a concept that would naturally appeal to small, particularly maritime states like Southeast Asians and the ASEANs. But as you would know, not one of the Southeast Asian states have explicitly or enthusiastically endorsed the free and open Indo-Pacific. I think and I'll never get a diplomatic posting to Southeast Asia after saying this, but I think we need to be a little bit firmer with the Southeast Asian states and ASEAN. Now, Southeast Asian states keep telling us that we do not want to be in a position where we're forced to choose. I would say to them that that's fine if facts on the ground are not changing, but facts on the ground are changing. China is making strategic gains at their expense over the last few years in a very significant manner. So if ASEAN states or Southeast Asian states refuse to choose and sit on the fence, that is making a choice. You know, Southeast Asian states and ASEAN have not been able to even put out a press release criticising Chinese behaviour, even mentioning the importance of national law and the arbitration decision, and yet they tell other countries, do not force us to choose. I think we should say to Southeast Asian countries, what is your highest priority? Your highest priority is to maintain your sovereignty, and that can only be done through the avoidance of the emergence of an Asian hegemon that may threaten your sovereignty. So that's a very uncomfortable conversation, but it makes eminent strategic sense. They know that. I think we do need to, in a sense, call their bluff and force them to choose, not necessarily between countries. They don't have to pick America or China, but they need to choose between principles. And I think we should be quite firm with Southeast Asian states. On ASEAN, ASEAN insists that it must retain its centrality. Now, centrality doesn't make sense unless great powers accept the centrality of ASEAN. And I think that that should be brought into play. If ASEAN wants to retain centrality, it has to be a useful player in supporting both its own interests and the interests of other states that recognise that centrality, and very clearly it's not. Now, ASEAN say to me, or say to Australia and say to other countries, it's our issue. I say to ASEAN, why is it your issue? Only 5 of you are claimant states. So why should ASEAN be central or lead the diplomatic charge on the South China Sea issue when clearly it's refusing to really make any decisions based on principles, even when the interests are being degraded? So my point now is not to say we should abandon ASEAN centrality, it is to impose conditions on ASEAN centrality, because no organisation has an automatic right to lead diplomatic activities in the region if they are not serving the interests of themselves or of that region. There was a question about a stable balance. What does a stable balance look like in the South China Sea? I often hear, well, you know, China's never going to leave its island, so what's the point? I think the balance we can get to, or where the position we want to get to through this strategic and military activity and coordination, is to eventually convince China that it is more vulnerable, not less vulnerable, by doing what it's doing in the South China Sea. And this brings me, and this goes to how you build up the capabilities of countries. But there was also a comment made that, you know, we obviously don't want to go to war. I mean, obviously we don't want to go to war, but I would say this, that you cannot take the credible use of force off the table. Because if you do that, then what would you do if you were China? You would keep going. If you actually take the credible use of force off the table, it doesn't matter how many ships, how many alliances, how many strategic coordinated documents you have, it doesn't matter as far as China is concerned. So my point is not to advocate warmongering. What I'm trying to say is we've got to work out ways of making China more vulnerable, not less, as a result of its activities. On a use of force, we need to work out when we would actually credibly use force and under what circumstances, and that should be left on the table, because otherwise, basically the game's up. I mean, put yourself in China's shoes. What would you do if you knew that force would never be used no matter what you did?
Thank you. We are running short on time, but I do want to take at least a few questions quickly from the audience. If you can make them concise and just very briefly state your name. I see from the front over here.
Well, thank you. My name is Liu Shizhong from Taiwan External Trade Development Council. I think one of the missing pieces, because we are talking about security networking, and Taiwan want to be part of it. I think one of the missing pieces in this discussion, which is very great, one of the missing pieces is about kind of technology cooperations. Dr. Lin Zhenyi mentioned a little bit about that. The reason why I mentioned that is because I think most people agree that the Chinese have adopted a lot of advanced technologies such like the artificial intelligence, quantum computing, a lot of things are robotic, to address not only domestic issue, domestic stability, but also apply it to foreign policy decision making and also apply it to cyber warfare. And that makes China not only a digital authoritarian regime, but also—
Sorry, but can you frame it as a question?
Yes,
Thank
Taiwan
you.
is very good at AI R&D. Google, Microsoft all decided to launch their R&D center, AI R&D center in Taiwan. That explains everything. So I was wondering, for the purpose of information sharing or capacity building, to what extent do you think Taiwan can contribute
Thank you.
in terms of technology cooperation?
Let's take a couple more, and then I'll individually farm those questions out.
Liang Rongling from Coordination Council of North American Affairs. I believe all the panelists are aware about the incident that China ordered the airlines to change Taiwan's designation. And after that event, there are voices on the internet, especially the Chinese people, saying that, hey, look, those countries, they can do nothing. So it's not, let alone, that's an illusion that when China comes to use force on Taiwan, the United States or any other country will come to rescue. So I'm wondering if there's any government or any think tank scholar, or any of you has ever thought of the way that that's an exercise of Chinese test on the so-called like-minded countries in terms of security networking. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll do one more. I see at the back.
Well, thank you. My name is Song Yang Hui from Institute of European American Study, Academia Sinica. The first question is related to the goal to promote respect for the rule-based order and to respect international law, including especially Law of the Sea Convention. The first question is addressed to our Australian, Japanese, and American speakers or discussants. Will you support Taiwan's position regarding legal status of Taiping Island, Ituaba, in the South China Sea, regarding the claim to 200 nautical miles exclusive economic zone, given the fact that US, Japan, and Australia claim that kind of right for your maritime features, which can be challenged as a rock under the 2016 arbitration award. Second question. Now, in my view, if I'm not wrong, it's possible to see some positive improvements in Japan-China relationship, and also Taiwan and China relationship is in the coming several months. To what extent, if that's true, that development, the trend of development, possible trend of development, will affect the idea to promote a free, open Indo-Pacific region? Thank you.
Great, thank you. We are running low on time, so I will sort of direct in these questions. I would ask, let's bracket the kind of technology cooperation question and start with, I think the broader question on are kind of improvements in relations with China, whether it's Japan, Taiwan, or others, inimical to a free and open Indo-Pacific. I would ask Abby to answer that question.
Thanks, Dan. So, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, I think that folks, when they were in the U.S. thinking about how to, develop and identify free and open Indo-Pacific, not everything that the United States does in Asia can be about China. I mean, certainly in the national security strategy, it was very blunt, labeling China a revisionist power, which I wholeheartedly concur with. But that's not a substitute for a positive U.S. vision in the region. And I would actually argue that you see a lot of continuity between the Obama administration's goals for the Rebalance Initiative and some of the themes in the Indo-Pacific today. So if an improvement in Japan-China relations, U.S.-China relations, China-anyone relations is shaping what our internal, goal is for the region, then that's not a vision. That's, something, half-hearted. So in short, no, I don't think it will affect our goals.
Thank you. I don't know if we'll get through all the questions, but I think the one on technology cooperation is one that we definitely did not touch on as a panel and is very relevant to security networking. So I want to direct this to both Dhruva and John, and just very quickly, whether it involves Taiwan or other democracies, but what do you see on the kind of defense side as opportunities to inject more technology cooperation as part of a free and open Indo-Pacific? And we'll start with John.
I mean, the short answer is yes, but I think the qualification is that, you know, if you look at the United States, Australia, for example, it's very easy, or it's eminently feasible to do technology cooperation, especially when it's military applications. When you have a pre-existing intelligence relationship, you have a pre-existing agreement on strategic objectives. You basically have a very common view of the world, and you have institutions in that other country that you actually trust. Right, so Australia, Japan, is, you know, the relationship there is, you can see it deepening in every way because those conditions fit. Now, when you're talking about other countries, let's bring one up, Vietnam. I mean, of course we want to raise the capacity of Vietnamese to defend their own sovereignty. There's always going to be limitations with the kind of cooperation we can have with countries like Vietnam because of those institutional and political, ideological type issues. We go as far as we can, but I think we've got to be realistic about the domestic and strategic conditions of a particular country.
On the issue of technology cooperation, so writ largely, I mean, I didn't go into a lot of detail on this, but that's one major area of increased defense cooperation, is reducing the barriers to technology cooperation in the military or dual-use sphere. And this has been particularly the case for India, which has been generally outside of the US alliance structures. So to give you one example, recently, the US Department of Commerce recently elevated India to a position in that basically waives a lot of licensing requirements for India to get access to cutting-edge defense technologies, on par with many NATO allies and close countries. This opens, amongst other things, this paves the way for cooperation in unmanned vehicles. Which is, I think, one area where we will see a good deal of cooperation. There's talk about possibly having Indian interface with, there's an entity called DIUX, which is based out in California, in the Bay Area. And so there is that kind of conversation. One area where I think we have to look at sort of comparative advantages, and I don't know enough about the tech sector in Taiwan, but, you know, for example, India has advantages in terms of space launch capabilities, which it can do at a much lower cost than many other countries, which again has a lot of potential military applications. One caveat, I think there's a lot of things that are happening in the private sector, which again is much more integrated. For example, Cisco, Google, Facebook, a lot of their R&D is actually being done in India, back-end work. And so how to actually harness what are very natural linkages in the private sector and the commercial space and bring, you know, find potential security applications for it is, I think, going to be something to, but not just with US companies, also the likes of SoftBank and Rakuten and others in Japan.
Great, we are out of time, so let me just quickly touch on the last two questions for sort of how to respond to China trying to coerce various foreign companies. Hopefully we'll hit on that in the next panel. To me, it's all about sort of having industries think about this problem across companies, so companies are not singled out one by one. On the question of kind of EZs, at least American policy has not been to kind of decide on the disposition of sort of sovereignty over various features and to adhere to international maritime law UNCLOS. So I don't necessarily see that changing imminently. With that, I want to thank both the panelists and the discussants. This has been a very fruitful conversation. I suspect we could continue much longer. I think a key takeaway for you all going into the next several sessions is that, in a sense, the security dimension of a free and open Indo-Pacific is the most advanced, and where all of us really need to dedicate even more energy is to the economic side and the governance side. So with that, thank you very much for your time.